Hello everyone, welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave. The following podcast is about historical perceptions and how they are changed based on the culture you live in. It is by Stefan Sase from Boiled Leather Audio Podcast and Stephen from Race to the Iron Throne blog and podcast. It was first published on December 2013 on Stephen's Nerdstream era podcast. We thought you might enjoy it. So Stephen and Stefan, let us borrow it.
Hello everyone, this is Stefan Sasse and we are in here for a second issue of the History Podcast after the first one which happened a few months ago. I will link to it where you video, and with me as with the last time is
Stephen Atwell.
Hi, Stephen. So, what we're talking today is not yet again virtual history like we did the last time, but this time we will talk about the differences in an approach to historical topics that come from living in different cultures. I mean, you are an American, I am a German.
Mm-hmm.
We both studied history, but I guess we and the cultures we live in, we have a different approach, a different take on many topics. And we singled out two topics that people in both countries at least have heard of, and we'll talk about just the general perception of it, how it is, and then we will go more into the historian area because also the academic historians have different takes on certain topics. And so our first topic will be the Civil War, the American Civil War, that is, or the War of the States, or what you want to call it. Here in Germany, it is only known as the Civil War. There are no other names usually used for it. So, what would you say? What place does the Civil War have in the American general consciousness?
Well, I would say, to start with, it is the war that Americans still can't agree about how to think about. I mean, you can see just this week there was a big protest in Florida over putting a Union monument on a battleground site that is a state park in which neo-Confederate groups vigorously protested the creation of a Union monument on the battlefield, and explicitly referred to it as like the second, that this fight over the monument would be the second battle of this particular place, and it remains, I would say, the most politicized of any war that we've ever fought. I mean, with Vietnam being a sort of a close second. In
Not
large
the
part,
American Revolution?
I mean, the American Revolution is something that everyone's in favor of. It's not something that you get sort of for and against. But
Okay.
you know, but the Civil War, in part, I would say in large part because of the history of the civil rights movement in America and the sort of the the rise of neo-Confederate groups during that period, and sort of the sense of what was called at the time massive resistance to civil rights, in the '60s, that it remains politicized. And I'll just start by sort of talking about. There's this really good book by historian David Blight called Race and Reunion, which is about he does the sort of public history of the war, namely the history of how the war is remembered. And he wrote this great book called Race and Reunion, in which he talks about there was sort of this competition right after the war ended and lasting arguably to the present day about which vision or which memory of the war would be the dominant one. And he breaks it down into four camps. He says you have the lost cause camp, in which the Confederacy was completely justified. It was not a war about slavery. This is where, like, the phrase, the war of northern aggression that you sometimes hear in the South comes from. There is the sort of reconcilianist vision that, after Reconstruction ended and the sort of I mean, especially the white populations of both the North and the South in the sort of 1890s through to the sort of 1920s and 30s had to figure out a sort of a modus vivendi that, how are these two sections of the country going to relate to each other? So they sort of came up with this reconciliationist memory of the war in which it was basically both sides were right, that you could admire both sides of the conflict, and it was very focused on the experiences of the soldier, and it was sort of admiring the heroism of the ordinary soldiers, how you could sort of um, look past the politics. And then there was this sort of there's this third vision which he calls a unionist memory of the Civil War, in which is sort of not really around anymore. It was very influential for about 30 years, after the Civil War, but has been forgotten, which was sort of emphasizing that the war was about preserving the United States government, preserving the Constitution, that saw the secession as kind of an anti-democratic impulse, and he argues that it's now been replaced by an emancipationist vision that says that what the Civil War was about was not you know independence for the South or the restoration of the Constitution. It was about ending slavery, and that today what we basically have is a contest between three visions. We have the lost cause, we have sort of a reconciliationist vision, and then we have an emancipationist vision. And that reconciliation has kind of fallen away, in part because of the sort of the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the sort of a new focus on slavery as kind of the central question. Um, so yeah, I'll stop there and let you respond.
Yeah, this is interesting because I have put up the question for the Civil War specifically because I think there is this really big divide. I only know about this four war theory that you just laid out for our listeners from my studies during history. Because here in Germany, at least, and I would go out on the fence and say in pretty much every other part of the world as well, the American Civil War is simply the war to end slavery. So it is the what you call the Union cause that is really the
Mm-hmm.
only interpretation that we have here. And while historians debate stuff like how much emancipatory was Lincoln really, and all that kind of stuff, the ideas of the lost cause or the reconciliation, blah, 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 you know what I mean, the version that both
Mm-hmm.
sides are somewhat noble and stuff like that, it really doesn't play any role here.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a average German guy who knows a little bit about history, they know two things about the American Civil War. One thing, there was Lincoln, and he freed the slaves. That's the most important thing. And
Mm-hmm.
second, there was Gettysburg. That's a
Right.
name that most people simply know, and I guess most people could also say that the Union won there, or the North.
Right.
No one talks about the Union here. It's always North with the South.
Mm-hmm.
Union and Confederation aren't really words that are used here. So you have really this one interpretation of it as a fight of good, the good Union versus the good North, versus the bad South. And now that I'm talking about it, at least the French are surely seeing it the same way, because there is a very popular comic series, because the French are big into comics, and they have this comic series of Western comics from, I
Oh,
guess, the 70s or
the
something.
blueberry.
Blueberry, exactly.
Yeah,
And
God, I've read that series translated into English.
yeah, I have it as a hardcover edition here on my shelf in the German translation because I don't speak any French. But this is very defining, I guess, because Western stories were for a very long time, especially here in Germany, a very popular subject, and the heroes of those stories always were the northern guys. You know, the guys in blue. They always were the heroes. I guess this has to do with that it is later the question of the color of the cavalry when they go into Indian territory. So if you tell stories where you have to fight Indians, you have the good guy cavalry come up and they are also blue. I guess that might have reinforced this a little bit, and not so
That's
much.
interesting.
I guess
That's
I'm
interesting
just
because
yeah.
that's very different from the sort of the popular culture and popular memory in the United States. In that, there's another book that I'd just like to mention. Gary Gerstle wrote a book called "Causes Won, Lost, and Forgotten," which is about the Civil War in pop culture, mostly about movies, about Hollywood movies. And he
You're
points
talking about
out,
the Civil War trilogy, right? So Gettysburg and Gods and Generals.
well, no. It's also about he goes through basically every movie made about the Civil War.
Okay.
So a lot of westerns, but think also like Gone with the Wind, or the outlaw Josie Wales. You know, a lot of and what he points to is that a lot of westerns more in the United States have Confederate veterans as protagonists.
Yes, that's right.
And it's almost never the case that the Union veteran is the protagonist, and in part it's because, you know, if you want to tell a story about, you know, an outlaw or a gunslinger who's somehow outside of society, that's kind of an easy angle in. And Gary basically in this book, Gary Gerstle points to, you know, early on in the history of Hollywood, you have a very strong presence of the lost cause. You know, one of the sort of
Gone
first,
with the Wind, right?
I mean, Gone with the Wind is a perfect example. You know, um, it was written by a woman who was part of an organization called United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are descendants of people who fought for the Confederacy. And it's full of these tropes of the lost cause, that, you know, especially about slavery, that, you know, the plantation of Tara as this beautiful place, and the place where all the slaves were happy and loyal and everybody got along, and then the evil Yankees came down and burned the place,
Yeah.
you know. And you know, so it was incredibly powerful. But you can go earlier back to that. The you know,
Birth of a
famously,
Nation.
yeah, Birth of a Nation is one of the sort of the most sort of talked about kind of early modern films in terms of the, you know, camera use and how the film was put together. But it was a, you know, a film in which Yankees are viewed as the bad guy, and the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, is the hero of that movie.
It is totally strange to Europeans, really. We would never even think of that.
Yeah, well, you know, and then he argues you go a little bit further along, and you get a more of a dominant reconciliationist narrative. I mean, you can think of movies like, even recent movies like Gettysburg, right? There's a lot of a focus on kind of, you know, that there were good people on both sides,
Yeah.
and, you know, it's a lot of it is about sort of, you know, Union officers, you know, and Confederate officers who used to be friends who are caught on opposite. You know, it's more about the sort of brother versus brother kind of angle.
Yeah, I guess this is also the reason why these movies never really went to popularity hereabouts. I think the most popular Civil War movie here in Europe or in Germany is Glory, because it serves the tropes that we are accustomed to much more directly. You
Right.
have the Union
And
guys as the heroes. You have the slave topic in it, and if I remember it correctly, there are no Southern protagonists. They are
no,
the faceless enemies that gun down the Black Regiment. So that
yeah, and Glory is part of a more recent trend of what Gerstle argues is sort of an emancipationist narrative of the war. So you think like movies like Glory or Lincoln, or I mean a little bit more loosely like Django Unchained or 12 Years a Slave, which is out now in theaters, which really kind of bringing the story of slavery in, but noticeably not very much about this sort of other vision of the Union, and about kind of what you know trying to explain the kind of the really, and this is where the kind of, I think, the historians versus popular culture thing comes in, because one of the things that historians kind of try to explain is the very complicated way in which a war that was initially you know um, where slavery was definitely the cause of it, but that the North initially did not make ending slavery a war aim, that it took 2 years
Yeah, I
for
mean
that
they
really
didn't, right?
to happen. And well, yeah, I mean, in the end, especially by the Emancipation Proclamation, the cause of the war shifted, and the aims of the North shifted, but that historians, and Gary Gerstle uh, wrote another interesting book called The Union Cause, in which he went through all of these letters written by Union soldiers, and tried to explain what it meant to them, the idea of the Union, because there's kind of a general conventional wisdom that says, well, the Union is kind of an abstract concept, and how do how would people really be willing to fight and die for something that's so abstract, as compared to, say, freeing slaves, or in the case of the South, for defending their own territory. And what he does, he goes through and really tries to tease out and explain um, what what the Union meant to them, what these ordinary soldiers. And he says, look, they write a lot about it, in their letters, and it's clearly something that they cared very much about. And he sort of ties it to this kind of, really, to the American dream as it was understood in the 19th century, that to sort of ordinary white Northerners who may not have liked slavery, but didn't feel in 1860 that they had to fight a war against it, that they viewed the Constitution as kind of a shield for the little guy, that it was there to sort of protect their rights and their opportunities, and that if secession was allowed, that the Constitution would no longer protect them, that slavery would be on the march, and that their opportunities, their own personal opportunities, to get ahead and make something of themselves, would be damaged. So he says that was kind of a motivation for a lot of soldiers, especially in the early phases of the war, in the first couple years before the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, that's really interesting because this whole rationale for the war, this whole discussion, states' rights versus the Union cause and all of that, it really doesn't play a role in public perception of the war here in Europe. It is just about the slave question, which allows everyone to put it in clear terms of good versus evil, because
Right.
I sometimes have the feeling that this whole discussion of the Union cause and the lost cause and stuff like that, while historically certainly being an issue, I mean, people discussed this back in the day. It sometimes muffles the side that slavery really was a thing. It was really bad, and from a today's perspective, you can't really understand how and why it worked. We will come back to the same topic, I guess, from the other direction when we later talk about World War II and the Holocaust. But here in this case, we Germans have the unique position to take up the moral high ground, because being the central power in Europe, we never had slavery. So it is easy for us to say, "Oh my God, those Americans! They can see." It is just this divide between the all men are created equal and you have slavery.
Right.
People don't understand how this goes together. It is just pure hypocrisy, and no talk of states' rights and all that lofty stuff can ever change that. If you
Yeah.
say the Union cause is abstract, try teach a German about what Southerners, even today in the United States, discuss. I know I have tried because 2 weeks ago I had in my history class I taught Civil War, and I brought them text documents, so speeches like from
Hmm.
persons like Calhoun and stuff, where they try to defend slavery as an institution. And I had pupils in my class who refused to actually defend these ideas, even as an academic exercise. They said, "I won't ever take this position here in class, even if everybody knows that it is just history."
Hmm.
They
Interesting.
they simply thought this so appalling, and that is a very common reaction here. So this whole debate, like it is in the United States, people don't understand it. For us here, it is totally crystal clear. You have the good North versus the bad South,
Right.
and there is nothing more to it. And if people look a bit deeper into the issue, and for example, they find out that anti-slavery only became a topic in 1862, 1863, they are asking themselves, what the heck did they fight for the first 2 years? And
Right.
and
Right.
they don't really understand it. And I guess this is a very very big divide between the American perception of the war and the rest of the world.
Yeah, and you sort of see a kind of a similar thing happening in American consciousness, which is that the part of the reason that the emancipationist are, understanding of the war has grown is that slavery is such uh, sort of an enormous moral issue that it does seem like the higher cause or the more important cause. And likewise, even on the sort of the neo-Confederate side, the lost cause folks, you've also seen in recent years a shift of argument there that instead of defending slavery as a benign institution, as would have been the argument that lost cause advocates would have made in 1910 or 1920 even or 1930 maybe, that instead they argue that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. So it's which I think is sort of a tacit uh, understanding on the side of even people who are organized neo Confederates, that slavery is a moral evil that can't be defended, and so you have to deny that it was the cause, and you have to invent other things. Um, so you can it's interesting. You can see even subconscious changes in historical understanding.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the American people at large have still a very important discussion about this in front of them. This is true to a lesser degree, by the way, also of the American natives and how America in general treated the American natives.
Yeah.
As I understand it, this discussion too is pretty much muffled in the United States, and we have, I mentioned it already. Western was a
Yeah.
very popular genre here in Germany,
It's
especially.
not anymore in the United. I mean, it likewise. It was a very popular genre in the United States, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
become much
It,
less popular today.
yeah, it lost its appeal more or less at the same time. But here in Germany, we had a particular direction that this took with the German writer Karl May. He was
Hmm?
a producer of very much, I guess you can call it pulp fiction. It really is bad literacy, but it was very, very popular
Hmm.
back in the day. End of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, Karl May was one of the most read German writers, and he wrote many westerns. And he had never been to the United States. He never left
Right.
Germany. He didn't know shit about American natives or cowboys or stuff. What he made up was what he knew. The cliches, and he just reinforced them with a factor of 10 or 20. And from him, the Germans have this very visceral image of the good and noble American native. as opposed to the bad white guy who just grabs the land and builds railroads and stuff. And then you have the blood brother of the noble chieftain and stuff like that, you know. And so there is also a very black and white view on that stuff. And I think that has transported into the Civil War.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of American popular culture, I mean the history of Native Americans, and especially the long and bloody history of conflict with you know with the West and eventually with the United States, is something that's really not talked about very much. It had a brief moment in the 1970s.
Yeah, I mean Johnny
It
Cash and
sort of,
stuff.
yeah, and there was at the time there was this very much inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement. There was the birth of the Native American movement. There was an organization called the American Indian Movement, or AIM, that famously occupied certain sites
Wounded
of
Knee, right?
Wounded Knee. Alcatraz was another one of them, and kind of there was a period in which there were several kind of clashes between, at the time, the FBI and the American Indian movement. But in terms of popular awareness, it's unfortunate that much these days. Really been a sort of a rediscovery of America's history with the Native Americans, in the same way that America's history on slavery is now a sort of a topic that major movies and now apparently television shows are going to be made about this period. But who knows? In 10 or 20 years, this might be the next kind of historical topic that somehow catches a kind of a pop culture wave.
Yeah, I guess we will have pretty much stuff coming up in that direction, and perhaps Quentin Tarantino's Django was just the first of many to come. Uh,
Yeah.
but I'd simply propose that we now move on to our next big topic in that discussion, which is, of course, World War II and the Holocaust. And the approach for beginning this topic that I propose is you tell me what you think that the German take on World War II is, and I tell you what I think what the American take is, and then we correct each other.
Oi. I mean, I the problem is, so I have studied modern European history. I haven't done a whole lot of it. It was like my uh, fourth or fifth field when I did my exams, and I know that I mean it's I feel really bad about generalizing, but
Yeah,
I do know that in the 60s and 70s there was kind of or sorry, initially after the war, that there was very much this concept of year zero, that kind of German history would sort of begin again in 1945, and that sort of wiped the slate clean. And then in the 1960s and 70s, that there was sort of a rediscovery of kind of the legacy of Nazism and the Holocaust, and kind of questions about, well, should Germany pay reparations to Israel, and what do you do about former Nazis who are still in government, and that kind of thing. And that it seems to have changed a lot today. I mean, I've when I went to Berlin in when was it? Must have been 2009. The Holocaust Memorial and the Museum of the Resistance and so forth. You seem, or at least it seemed from the outside that there was much more kind of popular awareness and consciousness of this period.
okay. Then I will straight go on into the American outlook. From what I gather, the American view on World War One starts basically
Wait,
with
sorry, World War I or World War II?
World War Two. Sorry, Did I say
Yeah.
World War One? I mean World War Two. Sorry. It basically starts with the Pearl Harbor attack on 1941. I guess the World War Two memorial even dates World War Two from 1941 to 1945, right? So
I don't know, but that sounds plausible.
yeah, so the in the American perception, the whole war starts basically with their own involvement, and what happened before is just a prelude that more or less takes on, and also for the Americans, the World War II represents this one war that was clean. It was a undeniable success. You had a
Mm.
real bad guy to fight. He was defeated in the end. You don't have a resistance later. So this is the archetype of how a war should be fought, and after it, all people were better off and stuff like that. So it is pretty much the good war,
Yeah, and
and
that was a phrase that was used um, after the fact. Literally the phrase "the good war,"
yeah, okay,
especially in comparison to say the Korean War or Vietnam.
yeah,
It
the
was
forgotten
sort
war,
of
right?
yeah, and the a few things that I just add on to that. In addition to the sort of the United States is the wronged party and that there's an ideological enemy and total victory. There's also this sort of economic prosperity angle that
Yeah,
for most of for pretty much all of Europe, World War II was a devastation. A truly catastrophic destruction of human life and of the physical environment and so on and so forth. But for the United States, it was a period of full employment. It was a period of rapidly growing wages. Of enormous advances in technology and in industrial production. So we I think that's kind of part of the reason why, and also the United States never suffered after Pearl Harbor, didn't suffer an attack on its homeland. It didn't have civilian casualties in any great number, so that it's got turned into the good war, and that sort of followed on with this veneration of the greatest generation, as it's called in the United States.
yeah, yeah,
That
I heard that one.
that somehow the generation that went through that war is somehow kind of nobler or accomplished more than generations that have come after it.
Yeah, you can see this pretty well in Mad Men,
Yep.
in the character of Roger Sterling, who always quotes his World War II experiences to Don Draper, who has only quote unquote the Korean War experience. And that's a pretty big difference here. And I also think that in the American perception of World War II, the Pacific Theater plays a much bigger role than it does for us. Here in Germany, it is yeah, Japan they fought as well, and obviously Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor is most important for the German perception of the war in that it brings the United States in. Without Pearl
Right.
Harbor, no Americans in the war, and that makes no D-Day and no liberation of Western Europe. Which directly brings me to the next topic, because the German view on World War II is a little bit strange, I guess, for foreigners, because I mean we started the whole damn war, which was, I guess, one of the most pointless wars ever fought, and not only did we start it, we committed one of the, if not the greatest war crime of all time, I guess, if you discount the Cambodians, and uh, and we lost it so completely. I think there are very few people who ever lost so completely in a war, especially in a modern time. So
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, that challenges you. And afterward, we were occupied for 4 years. There was no Germany. There was an occupation. There were occupation zones: an American one, a British one, a French one, and a Russian one. And
Mm-hmm.
only 4 years later did they refound Germany, and not only one but two Germanys. And that presented all kinds of problems in perception of the war. And as you
Mm-hmm.
already pointed out, this perception changed over time. What you said is basically true for the Holocaust, which I will come later. I want now to concentrate on the military part of the war. And
Okay.
here, a very interesting change can be found, especially in the 1990s, because from the end of the war until basically the end of the 80s, in public German perception, there were two fronts. You know, there's the Eastern Front where you
Right.
fight against the Soviets, and the Soviets, they are not exactly evil, because the evil spot is reserved for Hitler and the SS and all of them. Especially, I mean ourselves. We are the evil guys
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
but the Soviets run a close second. You know, they are viewed not really as an enemy, but more as a natural catastrophe.
Huh.
You know, the advancing Red Army is Germans were very good in totally forgetting why the Red Army was advancing in the
Right.
first place, because we attacked them. Germans were very good in ignoring and forgetting this particular detail, and simply painted the advancing Red Army in terms of a natural catastrophe. If you look at contemporary texts, you can really see how they try to convey
Hmm.
this imagery, you know? And on the other hand, we have the Western Front, where the Americans, especially, but also the British and French and all the other guys, are invading, and that is the liberation. You know, in
Mm-hmm.
especially in the later stages of the war, Germany tried, or parts of the German forces tried, to loosen the West as quickly as they could, uh, in order to let the Americans advance as
Right.
far into Germany as possible, so that they would occupy it and not the Russians. They did not know that there were treaties between America and the Soviet Union to prevent just this, but at least they tried. You know, you have this ambivalence between the Russians and the Americans. And this late changed in the 1990s. And my personal theory is that it has to do with the dying of all the veterans.
Mm-hmm.
Since the 1990s, the number of survivors from World War II is very rapidly declining.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we are taking on the American narrative. The Eastern Front in Germany today is more or less forgotten. If you
Hmm.
ask people about the Eastern Front, they can cite Stalingrad and not much more. You know, Stalingrad, the major turning point of the war, which is a bunch of
Yeah.
malarkey, by the way, but that's the public perception. And the people don't really know that much more. All these horror stories and stuff, they have faded into the background. They are more or less lost in the public consciousness, and instead we have totally taken on this American perspective that the Western Front was decisive. D-Day as the
Huh.
major event of World War II, and this is a very recent phenomenon. And I think
It's
that is
interesting.
pretty interesting, and it was reinforced by many Hollywood movies, especially Saving Private Ryan, but also different
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah.
And
I was just gonna
this is
bring
a
that
very
up.
profound change.
Yeah. I was gonna say, in the United States, um, it's almost all the Western Front. You do have some Pacific theater, but only in terms of the popular conception. You know, early in after the war, you have sort of the John, or even during the war, you have the sort of the John Wayne hitting the beach movies,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the American perception of the Pacific theater. But the Pacific War became less popular than the Western Front as kind of America's image of the war, in part because it's hard to talk about the Pacific theater without talking about the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States, without talking about the atomic bomb and America's use of the atomic bomb, which is also something not really talked about or thought about. Um, and there's nothing on the Eastern Front. I mean, I was, and the idea that the USSR played any role in the war, is not really part of popular consciousness. And I was trying to think, had I ever seen a movie, a mainstream Hollywood movie about the Eastern Front, and the only thing I could think of was that awful Enemy at the Gates movie.
Oh my God.
But if I had to sort of historicize popular conception of the war, I'd say that you have sort of an early phase in which it's very much like John Wayne movies on the one hand, so depoliticized soldiers hitting the beach, and then you have Casablanca as kind of the opposite model, which is that that does have politics in it. That's about should the United States be in the war? It's about resistance to fascism, and it comes from a more left wing kind of perspective in Hollywood. And then these days, what you basically have is sort of Saving Private Ryan, slash Band of Brothers, with a side of like Schindler's List. That's kind of the two images, in America's minds is basically the war is the Western Front and it's the Holocaust. So it's sort of, we get a little bit more of the kind of the harshness of war, but we don't have still any kind of conception of the politics surrounding the war, and very little consciousness of the Pacific. I mean, that's starting to change a little bit. You had that movie, The Thin Red Line. You also had the HBO series, The Pacific, and sort of, which kind of took a look at like how Americans thought about the Japanese during the war. But it's it is really thin on the ground, and there's a reason that I focus on this just because I wrote an article on this, but Captain America, right, as sort of the archetypal World War II superhero from the American side, in comic books and whatnot. He's always fighting in the Western Front, not in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, the public perception of the Soviet Union and its role in World War II is massively shaped, of course, by the Cold War.
Yeah,
Because I mean, the Soviets were the enemies, and especially here in Germany, they occupied the eastern zone of Germany and made it into their own state. And we always had this direct comparison just over at the border between the two systems, and you couldn't really talk about the Soviet Union as the good guys. You couldn't put him in the evil end either, because, as I've already said, it was reserved for Hitler and his cronies. But and that was a real problem for a long time, and now they have found the convenient way out because the veterans don't demand their place in the public remembering in the public memory anymore. So you can just go over and accept that American thing that the Western Front was the decisive, which is really just stupid. If you look at the numbers, one of every
yeah,
10 German soldiers fought
yeah,
at the Western Front.
yeah, it's really the numeric. Whoops, sorry. Google Chrome just crashed.
No problem.
Yeah, if you look at the numbers, it's not a contest. The war really was the Eastern Front and the Pacific Theater. I mean, which was kind of a massive endeavor all of its own. It's just one that doesn't lend itself as easily to a sort of a heroic narrative, if you will.
Yeah, it is. It is also very interesting in the German consciousness, and I would be interested in the American take on it. Just how the war and Hitler's rise to power, how this does compute. Who is responsible? There is this narrative that Hitler was democratically elected by the German people who were frustrated with Weimar Republic for various reasons and stuff like that, and that in the beginning the Hitler years were good years, economic prosperity and all that, and that it then turns sour.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, in terms of the popular understanding, I'd say that insofar as people know anything about how Hitler came to power, the sort of big narrative is kind of Versailles, um,
yeah,
and
that's
the flip side is, I would say, the other narrative is the eternal lesson of Munich, that the one sort of thing that has really kind of remained in the popular consciousness is this idea that if the West had done something at Munich, had not appeased Hitler, that the war could have been prevented, that Hitler could have been stopped, and it's become a lesson that sort of in a way can't be unlearned. So during Vietnam, the reason that American policymakers would constantly refer to Munich, and we can see like even as
Cuban Missile
recently,
Crisis.
yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was another example, and then as recently as the Iraq War, where the United States was in no danger of being invaded by Saddam Hussein, but American secretaries of state went on national television and like made arguments about Munich.
Yeah. The interesting thing is about Munich that it doesn't really play a large role in the German consciousness. I mean, you are getting, if you are in school, you will hear excessively about National Socialism and Holocaust, which is a very common complaint here in Germany. But the Munich conference is normally just put in a larger context of foreign Nazi foreign policy, and as more, because we have a problem here in Germany, because World War II and the clear guilt that we have in starting it, and the clear decision in that we lost it totally, meant that Germany went on a road of more or less pacifism. The German people are not exactly kindly predisposed towards the idea of a preemptive strike and stuff like that, which is one of the big reasons why we didn't partake in the Iraq War. And that pretty much prevents a serious discussion about Munich, because the alternative to Munich is always the Western powers more or less provoking a war with Hitler. And while it may be true that this would have prevented World War II and that it would have been the better alternative, it is very hard from a German perspective to argue that it would have been the best course to start a war in 1938. You know what I mean? It just
Yeah,
runs counter to everything that is embedded so deep in the German consciousness. I guess that is one of the reasons why we don't discuss Munich that much. It is also no reference point whatsoever for German policy, especially foreign policy. It doesn't play a
right.
role.
Interesting. So I'm kind of running out of time here, so maybe we could. I hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
So maybe we can find some note to wrap this up on.
We can find what?
A note to wrap this topic up on. I need to get going.
Okay, then, well, right one.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well,
I mean, that was metaphorically speaking. So, do you have some conclusion to it? Some lesson to draw from
yeah.
all of this?
I mean, I guess the overall lesson I'd draw is that I think historians need to be more active in our popular culture and need to get a more nuanced view of our history out there, so that and also to challenge the kind of the popular conceptions of our history that are floating around out there, so that we can hopefully get to a better understanding of where we've come from and where we are.
Yeah, I pretty much draw the same conclusion. I think if we let people run the discussion that clearly have political intention with it, in the U.S. obviously this is this confederacy stuff, which in which effectively um, does legitimize racism and slavery 200 years later, 100 years later. And here in Germany, we also have all kind of problems with people who try to propagate this clean slate stuff, which I personally think is a really stupid thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where historians have to get involved, and where they have to involve themselves really actively in the public debate.
Agreed.
Okay, and then I hope we can take this discussion up in our third podcast sometime later. I guess this is not yet finished for us.
Okay, doke. All right. See you
Okay,
around.
see you. Have fun.